In the dimly lit room, the only sounds were the steady hum of a computer and the occasional distant bark of a dog. Ethan, a seasoned Redditor and an avid consumer of all things peculiar, was hunched over his laptop, his eyes scanning through forums looking for something that could satisfy his craving for the eerie and unexplained. His interest in the dark web had recently escalated, fueled by stories of its untraceable mysteries and supposed supernatural phenomena reported by anonymous users. Tonight, Ethan stumbled upon a thread titled True Unsettling Dark Web Horror Stories. As he clicked on it, a chill ran down his spine, not just from the ominous title but from the eerie glow of the screen that painted his face in shades of ghostly blue. The first post was from a user named DarkKnight44, and it read, "Ever heard of the shadow web? It's said to be layers beneath the dark web, a place where the darkest of human curiosities find their nest. But it's not just human horrors that lurk there are doors to things beyond our understanding, things that the sane mind should avoid." Ethan was intrigued. The supernatural had always drawn him in, more than the stories of hitmen or illicit trades. He dug deeper, clicking on links and following threads until he found a supposed access guide to the shadow web. It was littered with warnings: do not proceed if you value your sanity. Throwing caution to the wind, Ethan began the process. The guide required several layers of security protocols and anonymous browsers that dug deeper into the web's underbelly. Each step was like peeling back a layer of reality, descending into a world where the rules of the mundane did not apply. Hours passed as Ethan maneuvered through digital labyrinths. Finally, a black screen loaded, displaying only a single line of green text: "Welcome to the shadow web, Ethan." The use of his name startled him. He hadn't entered it. The screen flickered, and then a chat window opened. The user, admin42, typed, "Looking for something unusual, Ethan. How do you know my name?" Ethan typed back, his hands trembling slightly. "We know all who enter. What are you seeking?" Admin42 replied. Ethan swallowed, his curiosity battling his fear. "Tell me something supernatural." Admin42 sent a link. "Click here. But be warned, opening this door might show you more than your soul can handle." As Ethan hovered over the link, the air in his room seemed to grow colder, and the dim light of his lamp flickered. A sense of dread washed over him, but his finger clicked the mouse. The screen went black for a moment before a video started playing. The footage was grainy, showing a dimly lit room where a figure sat facing away from the camera. A voice, distorted and chilling, began to speak in a language Ethan couldn't recognize. As the voice grew louder, the figure started to tremble violently. Suddenly, the figure turned, its face not human, its eyes black voids that seemed to stare right through the screen. Ethan recoiled, but he couldn't look away. The voice stopped abruptly, and a new text appeared on the screen: "Come find me, Ethan." The video ended, and the room's temperature returned to normal. Ethan sat back, his heart racing, unsure if what he had seen was real or some sick joke. He tried to exit the shadow web, but the browser wouldn't close. A new message popped up from admin42, "You've seen. Now you belong." Ethan restarted his computer, trying to shake off the unease. When his desktop reloaded, all seemed normal. He decided to take a break, stepping out into the night for some fresh air. As he walked down the quiet street, the earlier fear began to dissipate. It was just a video, he reassured himself. But the night was unusually still, the usual sounds of the city absent. A fog began to roll in, thick and obscuring, and Ethan's steps slowed. He looked back towards his house and froze. Standing in the window was the figure from the video, its dark eyes visible even from the street. Panicking, Ethan ran back towards his house, but as he approached, the figure vanished. He rushed inside, locking the door behind him. His mind raced. Had he really seen it? Was it a trick of the light? Or had something from the shadow web followed him back? Ethan went back to his computer, determined to find answers. But as he sat down, the lights flickered, and the temperature dropped. On his screen was a new message: "Welcome back, Ethan." He typed frantically, "What do you want from me?" The reply came instantly: "You opened the door, Ethan. Now we're here." The chilling reply sent another wave of fear through Ethan. He scanned the room nervously, half expecting to see the dark figure materialize out of thin air. The silence of his apartment was oppressive, every creak and groan of the building a reminder of his not-so-alone status. His mind raced with possibilities. Had he inadvertently invited something sinister into his life? Driven by a mix of terror and determination, Ethan typed back, "What do you want from me?" "We want you to understand." The message came quickly, as if they were eagerly awaiting his questions. "To see what lies beyond, to embrace it." Ethan's fingers hesitated over the keyboard. Embrace it. The very thought sent shivers down his spine. He wasn't sure he wanted any part of whatever this was. But another part of him, the part that had driven him to explore the dark web in the first place, was intensely curious. "What do I need to do?" he typed, his curiosity overtaking his fear. "Meet us. Midnight. The old mill on Carson's Ridge. Come alone." The instructions were clear, and the message ended with a finality that left no room for argument. Ethan sat back, staring at the screen. The old mill was notorious in his town for being haunted. It was the kind of place local teens dared each other to visit on Halloween. A perfect setting for a horror movie, and now, his reality. As the hours ticked by, Ethan wrestled with his decision. Part of him wanted to dismiss it all as an elaborate hoax, to shut down his computer and forget about the dark web and its shadows. But the other part, the part that had clicked the link, needed to know. Finally, as the clock struck 11, Ethan made up his mind. He grabbed a flashlight and his jacket, then headed out into the chilly night. The streets were deserted, a thin mist curling around streetlights like wraiths. Every step he took toward Carson's Ridge felt heavy, as if he were walking deeper into a nightmare. The old mill loomed up ahead, its dilapidated structure barely visible through the fog. As he approached, the sound of the river rushing nearby was the only thing that pierced the silence. Ethan's flashlight beam danced over graffiti-covered walls and through broken windows, creating eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. As midnight approached, Ethan positioned himself near what remained of the main entrance, his heart pounding in his chest. The air grew colder, denser, as if anticipating what was to come. Then, as the clock struck 12, the atmosphere shifted. A low hum filled the air, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Ethan's flashlight flickered, then died, leaving him in complete darkness. Panic surged through him, and he fumbled with the flashlight, trying to bring it back to life. It flickered on just in time for him to see them, figures emerging from the shadows, their forms indistinct but unmistakably human. Or were they? As they stepped into the faint light, Ethan could see that their eyes were too dark, their movements too fluid, almost as if they were part of the shadows themselves. "Ethan," one of them called out, its voice a whisper that echoed off the stone walls. "You came. What are you?" Ethan managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "We are the dwellers of the threshold, the ones who live in the shadow between worlds," the figure replied, moving closer. The air around it seemed to shimmer, as if it were distorting reality itself. Ethan wanted to run, to escape this madness, but his legs wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, transfixed by the creature before him. "You sought knowledge, Ethan. We can give it to you," another figure spoke, stepping forward into the light. "We can show you worlds beyond your understanding, secrets of the universe hidden in the shadows." The offer was tempting, horrifyingly so. Ethan felt a pull, a desire to know, to see what they spoke of. But at what cost? As he hesitated, the figures waited, their silent patience more terrifying than any threat. The mill seemed to close in around him, the shadows deepening, the river's rush louder in his ears. "You must choose, Ethan," the first figure said. "Embrace the shadow, or live in ignorance." The weight of his decision pressed down on him, the darkness palpable, waiting for his answer. But before he could speak, a sudden sound shattered the silence, the distant howl of an animal, or perhaps something else, something not quite of this world. The figures turned, their attention momentarily diverted, and in that split second, Ethan's paralysis broke. He took a step back, then another, his mind racing. Should he embrace this unknown, dive into the depths of knowledge that could unravel his sanity? Or should he turn and run, escape back to the safety of ignorance? The shadows seemed to pulse with anticipation, the darkness around the figures swirling as if agitated by his indecision. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs, fear and fascination warring within him. The figures stood silent, their inky black eyes fixed on him, waiting. He took another step back, the old wooden floorboards creaking under his weight, a sound monstrously loud in the oppressive silence of the mill. "You cannot flee your curiosity, Ethan," one of the shadowy figures said, its voice smooth and enticing. "It brought you here, to us. You've already stepped beyond the mundane world. There's no path back to it that won't be shadowed by what you've learned tonight." Ethan's back hit something solid, the cold, hard surface of an old milling machine. Trapped, he glanced around frantically, realizing the shadows were slowly, almost imperceptibly, closing in around him. The air grew colder, a palpable chill that seeped into his bones, and his breath misted in the air before him. I need to think," Ethan stammered, his voice cracking under the strain of his fear. "There is no time for thought," another figure declared, stepping forward. The ground beneath its feet seemed to darken, as if absorbing the scant light remaining. "There is only acceptance or denial, and each carries its own consequence." Ethan felt the darkness tug at the edges of his mind, a seductive call to let go, to dive into the abyss and embrace whatever lay beyond. He could almost hear whispers in the shadows, voices not quite human, murmuring secrets meant only for him. "Show me," Ethan said, his voice a mix of dread and desire. "Show me what lies beyond, if that's my fate." The figures paused, and for a moment, the mill was silent except for the rush of the river outside. Then, slowly, one of the figures extended a hand, its form shifting, blurring, like smoke caught in a breeze. Ethan reached out, his hand trembling as it approached the inhuman appendage. Just before their hands touched, the figure's eyes flared brighter, and a shock of energy pulsed through the air. Ethan's eyes widened in terror and Aura's visions assaulted him, images of other worlds, dark stars, entities of incomprehensible form and thought, realities where the laws of physics and sanity held no sway. The knowledge was overwhelming, flooding his mind, tearing at the fabric of his understanding. Ethan cried out, pulling his hand back, but the connection had been made, the knowledge imparted. He stumbled backward, clutching his head as the mill spun around him. "You are now part of the threshold, Ethan," the figure intoned. "You can never unsee what has been shown. You will always be part of this shadowed realm." The figures began to fade, dissolving into the darkness from which they had emerged. Ethan was left alone, the echo of their words mingling with the visions that now haunted his thoughts. He sank to his knees, overwhelmed, his mind racing through the cosmic horrors and dark wonders he had glimpsed. As the initial shock began to subside, Ethan's survival instincts kicked in. He had to get out, had to leave this place. He staggered to his feet, his movements shaky, and made his way to the door of the mill. The night outside seemed different now, shadows more menacing, the darkness more complete. Every sound was a whisper from those other places, every shadow a potential gateway. Ethan's walk back to his home was a blur of fear and confusion. The streets were empty, the fog thicker than before, as if the world was cloaking itself in secrecy. When he finally reached his apartment, the relief was palpable, but as he locked the door behind him, he knew no lock could keep out the darkness he had invited into his life. Sitting in his living room, the after-images of those otherworldly visions flickering before his eyes, Ethan knew he had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The shadow web had shown him its secrets, and now he was irrevocably changed. As he contemplated his new reality, a slow, creeping realization dawned on him. The journey into the unknown had just begun, and the shadows he had encountered would not let him go so easily. They had plans for him, and the night's events were only the beginning. Outside his window, the world seemed to watch, wait, and whisper. And somewhere in the darkness, the figures from the mill were surely watching too, their designs on Ethan far from over. The line between his world and theirs had blurred, and he was now caught in the twilight, a place where light and shadow intermingle, where reality bends, and where the horrors of the shadow web creep ever closer. Ethan sat alone, the flicker of his computer screen the only light illuminating the room. Their haunting images that he had been forced to witness replayed in his mind like a relentless storm, each vision darker and more terrifying than the last. The boundary between the physical world and the shadow realm he had glimpsed seemed to thin, making every shadow stretch longer, every silence more suffocating. As he tried to focus on the normality of his living room, the familiar began to warp, imbued with the alien essence of the shadow realm. The walls seemed to breathe, a soft, almost imperceptible movement like the chest of a sleeping giant. The corners of the room, where the shadows were deepest, appeared to pulse gently, rhythmically, as if something lurked just beyond his perception. Ethan's mind raced with the implications of his newfound connection to the shadow web. It wasn't just about seeing, it was about being seen. He felt exposed, vulnerable not just in his physical space but within his own mind. The entities had shown an ability to reach out, to touch, and now, he feared, to take. The air around him grew colder, the chill seeping into his bones. His breath misted in the air, and with each exhalation, he felt as if he was losing a part of himself into the growing darkness of the room. It was as if the darkness was alive, feeding on his fear. A sudden noise, a low, droning hum, began to fill the room. It was subtle at first, barely audible over the pounding of his own heart. But it grew steadily louder, resonating deep within his chest, vibrating in his bones. Ethan clapped his hands over his ears, but the sound seemed to bypass his physical hearing, resonating directly in his mind. He stood up, staggering as the room tilted around him. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching towards him like dark fingers. In a panic, he headed for the door, needing to escape, to see the sky, to confirm that the world was still real. But as he reached for the door handle, the wood of the door began to warp and twist, the grains flowing like liquid under his touch. He recoiled in horror as the door transformed, becoming something organic, pulsating with a dark life of its own. It was no longer a barrier to the outside, it was a part of the shadow realm, a piece of a puzzle that was slowly enclosing him. Trapped, Ethan backed away from the door, watching as the room continued to change. The furniture began to deform, edges blurring and colors bleeding out as if the very reality of them was being questioned. The digital clock on the wall flickered erratically, its numbers dancing chaotically before settling on symbols Ethan could not recognize. Desperate, he turned to his only link to the outside world, his computer. Rushing to the desk, he attempted to send out a message, an email, anything that could reach someone beyond his corrupted sanctuary. But as he typed, the letters on the keyboard scrambled, morphing into the strange symbols from the clock. The screen displayed images that twisted and turned, scenes of other places that defied the laws of physics and sanity. Ethan stepped back from the computer, his mind reeling from the assault. Their humming grew louder, now accompanied by whispers, voices that seemed both alien and achingly familiar. They called his name, beckoning him to look deeper into the screen, deeper into the darkness. He felt his resistance crumble as his curiosity, the very trait that had led him to this nightmare, reasserted itself. Ethan leaned closer to the screen, the shadows around him moving closer, as if eager to witness his surrender. The images on the screen solidified, showing a path that led deeper into a darkness so profound it seemed to absorb all light, all hope. And down that path, a figure waited, its outline blurred but unmistakably one of the shadow entities from the mill. It beckoned to him, a gesture that was both an invitation and a command. Ethan knew he should turn away, should close his eyes and block out the voices. But the path called to him, promised answers and secrets that part of him still desperately wanted to know. With a trembling hand, he reached out towards the screen, towards the path. Just as his fingers were about to touch the glass, a sharp knock at the window snapped him out of his trance. He whipped around, heart racing, to see nothing but his own pale, terrified reflection staring back at him. The room was silent now, the humming and whispers gone as abruptly as they had begun. But the respite was temporary. As Ethan turned back to the screen, the figure was closer, its features clearer. And the path it stood on seemed to stretch not just into the screen, but forward, into his very room, inviting, or perhaps demanding, that he step onto it. Torn between the palpable fear gripping his heart and the insatiable curiosity that had always driven him, Ethan hesitated. His room, once a haven of solace, had transformed into a threshold between realms, an entrance to the unknown horrors that beckoned from his computer screen. With every second that passed, the line that tethered him to his reality seemed to fray further, pulling him inch by inch towards the abyss that awaited. His gaze locked onto the figure on the screen, its form becoming clearer with each moment. It was neither wholly menacing nor inviting, but it exuded an aura of inevitability, as if its presence was a fixed point in time and space that Ethan was destined to encounter. The figure raised its hand, palm open, as if waiting for Ethan to place his own within it. The air in the room thickened, crackling with unseen energy. Objects began to vibrate slightly, books rattling on their shelves, the light bulb above flickering with increased fervor. A low whisper filled the room again, this time a chorus of voices that seemed both distant and intimately close, speaking a language that Ethan could not understand but felt oddly familiar. You must choose, Ethan," the figure spoke, its voice resonating within the very walls of the room. "Step forward into knowledge, or remain forever on the edge of understanding." Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he listened to the spectral invitation. The darkness around the edges of his vision seemed to pulse, beckoning him to step forward. He felt a pull, an almost physical tug on his consciousness, urging him towards the screen. With a shaky breath, Ethan stepped forward, his hand reaching out towards the figure. As his finger touched the screen, a shock of cold ran through him, like icy water rushing over his skin. The room around him blurred, the walls stretching and distorting as if reality itself was warping. He blinked, and when his eyes opened, he was no longer in his apartment. Instead, he stood on a narrow path surrounded by an oppressive darkness that swallowed all light except for the path under his feet, which glowed faintly with an ethereal silver light. The figure stood before him on the path, its features now sharp and terrifyingly defined. "Follow," it said simply, turning to walk down the path. Ethan, driven by a force he could neither deny nor understand, followed. The path wound through the darkness, twisting and turning in ways that defied all sense of direction and physics. Sounds whispered around him, soft murmurs, and cries that made his skin crawl, yet he could not see their sources in the consuming dark. With each revelation, Ethan felt a growing sense of urgency. The dangers were real, not just to him but to the entire fabric of his reality. He needed to find a way to protect his world, to prevent the darkness from consuming it as it had threatened in the visions. Finally, they reached the heart of the library, where a single pedestal stood holding a tome larger than any Ethan had seen before. Its pages were open, the symbols glowing faintly. "This is the Book of Thresholds," the figure said solemnly. "Within lies the power to alter the paths between worlds, to strengthen or weaken the barriers that keep the darkness at bay." Ethan stepped forward, the weight of his task settling on his shoulders. "What must I do?" he asked again, this time with a sense of resolve that surprised even him. "You must choose a path and inscribe it here," the figure replied, pointing to the glowing pages. "Your actions tonight will not only shape your fate, but that of your entire world." Ethan looked down at the book, the symbols shifting into a language he could suddenly understand. The power to change reality was at his fingertips, the knowledge of the archive of shadows flowing through him. He took a deep breath, the air heavy with the scent of ancient ink and hidden truths. With a steady hand, he reached out to the page, the symbols ready to be rearranged by his touch. As his fingers made contact, a surge of energy coursed through him, a connection forming between him, the book, and the shadowy paths he sought to alter. The library began to dissolve around him, the shelves fading into mist, the books evaporating into whispers of forgotten knowledge. Ethan stood firm, the Book of Thresholds the only solid thing in a world unmooring. He focused on his task, the symbols under his fingers dancing to his will, weaving a new reality from the shadows of the old. As the last symbol settled into place, a brilliant light burst forth, engulfing him, the book, and the remnants of the library. The light was blinding, all-consuming, and when it finally faded, Ethan found himself back in his apartment, the familiar surroundings starkly mundane after the realms he had traversed. But the darkness was no longer a threat lurking in his peripherals, it had receded, at least for now. Ethan knew his actions had altered the course of events, had pushed back against the encroaching shadows. He also knew this was only the beginning of his vigil, the first of many nights he would spend guarding the thresholds between worlds. The figure from the library was gone, but its final words echoed in his mind: "The balance is ever in motion, and you, Ethan, are now its keeper." As dawn crept through his window, casting light where shadows had once ruled, Ethan felt a new purpose awaken within him. The night had been long and harrowing, yet it had forged him into a guardian of the fragile veil that separated his world from the darkness that sought to devour it. Standing in his living room, Ethan looked around, seeing the familiar in a new light. Everything appeared the same, yet he knew it was all fundamentally altered by his actions and the knowledge he now carried. His computer, once a portal to mysteries and digital depths, now sat silent, a benign witness to the night's surreal journey. Ethan approached it, hesitant at first, then resolute. He powered it up, half expecting the shadows to reach out from the screen once more. But the screen lit up to his desktop wallpaper, an ordinary scene of a sunlit forest path, undisturbed by the night's events. Ethan exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of exhaustion and relief. He glanced at the clock, it was just past dawn. The city would be waking soon, life continuing unaware of how close it had come to a shadowy abyss. In the soft light of morning, the terror and darkness of the night began to recede, like a nightmare fading upon waking. Yet, the reality of his new role lingered palpably in the air. He walked to the window, pulling the curtains aside to let in the new day's light. The sun edged above the horizon, its rays spilling over the cityscape, bathing everything in a warm, golden glow. The normalcy of the sunrise reassured him, grounding him in the world he knew and loved, a world he had managed to protect, if only for a while. But as Ethan watched the city stir to life, he knew his journey was far from over. The shadows might have been pushed back, but they would gather strength again, as they always had throughout history. He was now part of an eternal vigil, a keeper of gates that should never be opened, a guardian against darkness that would always seek to seep through the cracks of reality. His life, from this day forward, would be a balance of light and shadow. Each day would be spent in the light of the ordinary world, each night in the watchful guarding of the extraordinary. The knowledge and power he had been granted came with an immense responsibility, one that he now accepted as his own. Ethan turned from the window, his gaze falling on the bookshelf where mundane novels lined up next to ancient, arcane texts he had brought back with him from the archive of shadows. They were reminders of his journey and his duty, tools and talismans for the path he now walked. As he prepared for the day, Ethan felt a newfound strength within him. The fear that had once gripped him was now a firm resolve. No longer was he merely a spectator of the supernatural and unexplained. He was a participant, a combatant in an unseen war that raged in the shadows of reality. The sun climbed higher, its light erasing the last vestiges of darkness from the corners of his room. Ethan smiled slightly, a warrior's grin, as he faced the new day. The battle had been won, but the war, the eternal struggle against the darkness, was just beginning. And so, with the light of dawn casting long shadows behind him, Ethan stepped out into the world, ready to face whatever came next. The shadows awaited, but so did the light, and he was ready for both. As the door closed behind him, the light in his apartment flickered briefly, a subtle reminder that the threshold between light and shadow is ever fragile, ever shifting. But for now, the balance held, the darkness at bay, the light prevailing. And somewhere, in the depths of the shadow realms, forces stirred, watching and waiting, their plans thwarted but not destroyed. They knew his name now. Ethan, keeper of the thresholds, guardian of the light. The game had changed, the players said. The story of Ethan and the shadows was far from over, but for today, the light was enough.